The sheriff found her bound across a stray saddle, a note reading stolen property. The horse came in without a rider. That's the first thing, not the woman, the horse. A roan gelding, half-lathered and wild-eyed, trailing its reins through the dust of Garfield Street at somewhere near 4 in the afternoon, and I was standing outside Hendrick's feed store with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand when it clattered past me. I set the cup on the rail and watched it go. Something tied across the saddle. A bundle. The way it shifted, I knew. I've been sheriff of Cutter County going on 19 years. I've seen bundles shift. I didn't run. I don't run anymore. Bad knee left one, from a fall off a roof in 1881 that I don't tell the story of. I walked fast, which is its own thing, and I got a hand on the trailing rein before the gelding could spook into the alley behind Malone's. The horse shied, came back to me, blew hard through its nose. I talked to it, low and even. That's how you settle a frightened animal. You don't grab, you just keep your voice steady and let them find the calm in it. The bundle across the saddle was a woman. Hands tied to her left ankle with a length of cowhide, wrists bound at her back with the same. She was face down, draped over the seat like a sack of oats, and she was conscious. I could tell from the way she'd gone still the moment the horse stopped. Not limp, still. There's a difference. Limp is gone, still is surviving. Pinned to the back of her coat was a folded piece of paper. I unpinned it without reading it. I didn't need to read it yet. What I needed to do was get her down. I untied her from the saddle first, then brought her upright against me, took her weight, walked her 3 steps to the rail of the water trough. She got her feet under her, didn't fall. I put a hand on her back between her shoulder blades and felt her breathe, one hard draw, then steadier. She had a cut along her left temple, dried blood in her hair, and her right cheek was swollen from a strike. Her coat was good wool once. Now it had rode dust and somebody's handprint on the sleeve. I cut the cowhide off her wrists with my belt knife. Her hands came around and she pressed them flat on the trough rail. I watched her knuckles, white, then less white. She was taking herself back from wherever she'd gone to get through it, and I gave her the time to do that without talking. Then I read the note. It said, "Stolen property, returned to Harlan Dusk Ranch, Mesa, PALO." That's all it said. I folded it and put it in my breast pocket. Her name was Vera Connell. I found that out later that afternoon in my office, after I'd walked her there, and sent my deputy Aldous for the doctor, and sat her in the chair across from my desk with a glass of water and a wool blanket from the closet because she was shaking, not from cold, but from the aftermath of whatever happens to a person when they've held themselves together long enough. She told me her name, and then she told me the rest, and I listened the way I've learned to listen in 19 years, without my face doing anything useful, just taking it in. She'd come west 4 months prior from Ohio. School teacher. She had a contract with the settlement at Red Fork, 22 miles north, and she'd arrived to find the schoolhouse wasn't built yet. The family she was to board with had moved on, and the man who'd organized the whole arrangement, a land agent named Gellert, had taken the settlement's money and wasn't anywhere to be found. So she'd done what a woman with $8 and a trunk of books does when she finds herself stranded in a country she doesn't know. She'd found work. Cooking and keeping house for a rancher named Harlan Dusk, who'd represented himself as a decent man and a fair employer. He was neither. I won't go through all of it. She didn't make me go through all of it right then either. She gave me the shape of it and I could fill the rest. Dusk had decided, somewhere in those 4 months, that because he'd housed her and fed her and paid her less than a third of what he'd promised, she was his. That the labor she'd given him canceled whatever debt he thought he was owed and then doubled back and made him the creditor. Men like that do the math in a way that always comes out in their favor. She tried to leave twice. Both times he'd had her brought back. The second time, he'd tied her to that horse himself and sent her to town as a message, not to her, but to anyone watching. Property returned. The doctor cleaned the cut on her temple and said nothing was broken. He left. Aldous went back to his rounds, and Vera Connell sat in my office in the early dark with the lantern going and looked at me across the desk. She said, "What happens now?" Not a question, more like a thing she was asking herself out loud to see how it sounded. I said, "Now I go talk to Harlan Dusk." She looked at me, not with hope. She was past hope at that point, I think. She looked at me the way a person looks at the last card in their hand, measuring. She said, "He has 8 men on his payroll." I said, "I know he does." She said, "He runs half the county commissioners." I said, "He runs 2 of them, there are 5. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You don't seem afraid of him." I thought about that. I said, "He doesn't scare me. What he did to you does. That kind of man, the kind who decides he owns a person, that kind of thing spreads if you let it, like dry rot. You've got to get at it." She didn't say anything to that, just watched me, and I felt, I don't know what to call it, not pride, something quieter, like purpose finding its shape again after a long time without one. "I am going to stop here and tell you something." I was 53 years old that fall. I'd been sheriff longer than most men stay at anything, and I'd been good at it, but the last few years had started to feel like the back half of a long day. My wife, Clara, had died in '87 from a fever that went fast. We didn't have children, that was its own grief, a different shape than losing her but connected to it. The house I went home to at night was clean and orderly and very quiet. I had Aldous, who was a good deputy and a decent hand at cards. I had the work which I believed in, but the believing had gotten quieter too, the way a fire gets when the wood's going to ash, still warm, not roaring. I tell you this so you understand what it was, walking into Dusk's territory the next morning. It wasn't nothing. I rode out at first light with Aldous and 2 men from town, Garrett Hughes, who ran the lumber yard and was twice the size of most people, and old Felix Prout, who was 68 and had been a ranger for 12 years before he lost 2 fingers on his right hand and retired. Felix could still shoot. The missing fingers didn't matter. It's the left hand that steadies and the right that squeezes, and he'd learned to do both with what he had. Dusk's ranch was a 2-hour ride into the mesa country, where the land went wide and flat and the sky came down close. I've always liked that country, even when it's working against you. There's something honest about it. Nowhere to hide. Harlan Dusk met us in his yard. He was a big man, heavy across the chest, with gray at his temples and the look of someone who's used to talking over people. He had 3 of his hands behind him, which told me he'd been expecting a visit and had staged himself for it. The other 5, presumably, were out on the range or in the bunkhouse, and I kept that number in the back of my mind like a stone in a boot. He said, "Sheriff Crane, didn't know you made ranch calls." I said, "Harlan, I'm here about the woman." He said, "Vera Connell is an employee under contract. She walked off a lawful employment agreement and took property that wasn't hers." He said it like he'd practiced it, which he probably had. I said, "What property?" He named some items, tools, a horse, a coat. I said, "The coat on her back when she arrived in town was hers from Ohio. I can produce the woman she boarded with in Red Fork who'll confirm it. The horse she came in on was yours, which I've already arranged to have returned." I paused. "What else?" He looked at me. He'd expected me to be deferential. Men like Dusk usually get deference from county officials because they've paid for it. I hadn't been paid for it, and he was recalculating. He said, "She owes 4 months' room and board at $8 a month." I said, "She's owed 4 months' wages at the rate you agreed on, which by her account was $12 a month, and by your own ledger, which I subpoenaed this morning from your account with the Territorial Bank, was contracted at 10. The numbers don't work in your favor, Harlan." I watched him take that. His jaw shifted. One of his hands behind him put a thumb in his gun belt, which was not quite a move but was the setup for one, and Felix Prout, who was watching from horseback in a way that looked casual, shifted his weight slightly in the saddle. Felix had a way of doing that, shifting, like a door easing open. Dusk said, You're making an enemy. I said, I've got enemies. One more won't change my sleep. I looked at him for a moment. This is how it goes, Harlan. Vera Connell is a free woman. She owes you nothing. You send any man of yours near her, I'll arrest you personally and hold you in county jail while I wire the territorial marshal and give him the ledger and the note you pinned to her coat. The note's interesting to a marshal. Stolen property, that's the kind of language that opens inquiries. You want an inquiry. He didn't say anything. I said I didn't think so. I turned my horse. Garrett and Felix and Aldous came around with me and we rode out of his yard at a walk. I didn't look back. You don't look back. Not because it's dramatic, because it costs you something if you do, some small part of the authority you've just built, and I'd earned every inch of it that morning and I wasn't giving any back. What I want to tell you is the ride home. We came down off the mesa just before noon, when the sun was starting to press. Felix rode up beside me and said, "That went better than I expected." I said, "He'll sulk a while." Felix said, "He'll more than sulk. He'll try something quieter." I said, "I know." Felix was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You care about this woman." I didn't answer that right away. I watched the plains going out ahead of us, brown and gold, a hawk riding something up above the ridge. I said, "I care about the law." Felix made a sound. It was not a disagreeing sound exactly. More like a sound that meant he'd heard what I'd said and also what I hadn't. Vera Connell was staying at the Cutter boarding house, which was run by a widow named Elsa Marsh. I'd arranged it the night before and paid Elsa for 2 weeks out of my own pocket, which I did not tell Vera. When I got back to town that afternoon and walked to the boarding house, Elsa met me at the door and said Vera was in the back garden if I wanted to speak with her. She was sitting on an upturned crate in the narrow strip of garden behind the house, shelling dry beans into a pot. She'd washed the blood from her hair, and the swelling on her cheek had gone from red to purple to a color that was trying to be normal again. Her hands moved through the beans without hurrying. She had that quality, I'd noticed it from the beginning, of not wasting motion. Everything she did was considered. Like she'd learned early that extra movement costs you, and she'd economized accordingly. She looked up when I came through the gate. I told her about the morning. Not all of it, not the part about the ledger, which she didn't need to know about, or Felix's shifting in his saddle, which was its own kind of story. Just what mattered. Dusk had been warned, the warning had gone in, and she was free to come and go without looking over her shoulder. For now. She listened, then she went back to the beans. After a moment she said, "Why did you subpoena his ledger?" I said, "It gave me something to work with." She said, "You did that before you knew if I was telling the truth." I said, "I knew you were telling the truth." She looked at me, "How?" I said, 19 years. You learn to read a person." She was quiet again. The beans went on. Then she said, "You paid for this." She gestured at the boarding house without looking at it. "Elsa told me." She's not a woman who holds secrets well. I said, "It's not a problem." She said, "It is to me. I don't take charity." I said, "It's not charity. It's the county's responsibility to provide safe housing to persons who have been." I stopped. I wasn't any good at that kind of talk, and she knew it. I said, "It came from my pocket. You can pay it back if you need to, or not. It doesn't matter to me either way." She looked at me for a long moment, not measuring this time, something else, something I didn't quite have a name for. She said, "All right." That was it, all right. I don't know why that sits with me still. 2 words, but there's a way a person says all right that means more than agreement. That means, I see what you're doing. I'm not going to fight it. Maybe I'm going to trust it. That's the one she used. The next 2 weeks I had reason to stop by the boarding house more than was strictly necessary. I brought her a letter that came for her at my office, her sister in Ohio, tracking her down. I told her about a teaching position that had come open at the schoolhouse in Fetterman, 12 miles east, and she asked me a series of exact and practical questions about the salary and the boarding situation and the parents of the students, and I answered the ones I knew and said I'd find out the rest. I found out the rest. She took the position. The day before she was to leave for Fetterman, I saw Dusk's man in town. Not Dusk himself. One of his hands, a lean, squint-eyed fellow named Cray who did the work Dusk didn't want attributed to him directly. Cray was standing outside the hotel with a glass of beer, watching the street. Watching, specifically, the direction of the boarding house. I walked to him. I said, "Cray." He said, "Sheriff." I said, "How's Harlan?" He said, "Getting along." I said, "Glad to hear it." I stood beside him, looked at the same street he was looking at, said, "You're watching the wrong part of town. There's nothing for you down that way." He looked at me from the side, said, "Just having a beer." I said, "Then have it and go home, because if I see you in town tomorrow or the day after that, I'm going to start thinking you're planning something. And I don't like to think that, because then I have to act on it before it happens, and that tends to be inconvenient for everyone." I let that sit for a second. "Clear." Cray looked at his beer, then he said, "Clear." He left that afternoon. I watched him ride out. I went to the boarding house and I told Vera that there'd been a man in town but that it was handled. She asked me if she was safe. I said, "You're safe." And I meant it the way you can only mean something when you intend to back it up with whatever's required. She looked at me then, really looked. Her face did something. I couldn't tell you what it did exactly because I'm not good with those things. Something settled in it. Something that had been held taut let go a little. She said, "I believe you." That hit me somewhere I wasn't expecting. There's a thing that happens when a woman who is not soft and not easy to convince, who has been through what she's been through and still has all her edges, tells you she believes you. It's not the same as when someone believes you because they don't know any better. It's different when they believe you because they've decided you've earned it. I hadn't been told anything I'd earned in a long time. I'd done the work and kept the office and held the county together, but nobody was tallying it up. You don't after a certain number of years. You just do it. But she was tallying it, and she told me. She left for Fetterman the next morning. Elsa Marsh drove her in the wagon with her trunk and her books, and I walked them down to the end of Garfield Street and put a hand on the wagon side and said goodbye. Vera had her good coat on clean now, the handprint gone. She looked down at me from the seat. She said, "I'll write you about the school so you know it's going." I said, "I'd like that." She said, "And if Dusk comes back?" I said, "He won't." She said, "But if?" I said, "If he does, he'll deal with me, not you." She looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a goodbye. Then she said, "You're a good man, Sheriff Crane." Quiet, like it wasn't a compliment but just a statement of fact, like telling a horse it's a good horse. Not flattering it, just calling it true. Elsa clucked at the mule, and the wagon rolled. I watched it go until it got small in the distance, and the dust took it. I'm going to tell you what happened in the months after that, because it matters to the shape of this. She wrote like she said she would. First letter came 6 days after she got to Fetterman. 3 pages, her handwriting close and level, and she wrote about the school the way she talked, practical, specific, no sentiment padded in where it didn't belong. 17 students. 3 of them could already read well. The rest were starting from scratch or close to it. The boarding situation was acceptable. The family she was with was decent. She asked me one question about local law, whether a certain family's land claim was registered, and I found out and wrote back. We wrote back and forth through the fall. Her letters got longer. Mine were shorter. I'm not a writer, never have been, but I answered everyone. November, she sent word that Dusk had ridden past Fetterman twice. Just past, not stopping, not doing anything that could be called a move, but past, twice in 1 week. I saddled up and rode to Fetterman. I wasn't going to wait for the 3rd time. I found Vera in the schoolhouse, which was a one-room building set back from the main street, still smelling of new pine. The students had gone home for the day. She was at the front of the room writing on the board, her back to the door, and she heard me come in and turned around, and I'll tell you this straight. Her face went from neutral to something else in a way that I noticed, and then didn't let myself think about because I had a purpose for being there, and I was going to keep to it. I told her about Dusk riding past. She said she'd seen him the second time and hadn't been sure if she should tell me. I said, "Always tell me," she nodded. I went and found Dusk at the saloon in Fetterman, which was called the Dusty Well, and was frequented mostly by men who were between ranches and not too careful about it. He was at a table in the back with two of his men. He looked up when I walked in and something moved across his face, not fear. Men like Dusk don't feel fear the way regular people do, but a recalculation. He was a man used to the numbers going his way, and here I was again, not going his way. I sat down across from him, without being invited. I said, "Harlan, we need to finish this conversation." He said, "I'm not aware we started one." I said, "I told you in September. Vera Connell is a free woman. You sending a man past her school twice in a week isn't you getting along. It's you pushing." He said, "A man can ride where he likes." I said, "He can, right up to the point where I decide he's doing it to intimidate a woman under my protection. Then he can't." I folded my hands on the table. "Here's where I am, Harlan. I've been patient with you because I gave you the chance to be smart. You weren't smart, so now I'm done being patient." He looked at me. His two men were watching. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do. He said, "You don't have jurisdiction here. This is Palo County." I said, "I deputized in Palo County this morning." That was true. I'd ridden to the Palo County Sheriff's office first and gotten it squared. I also sent a full written account of the September incident, the note, the cowhide, the ledger to the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe. He hasn't acted on it yet. Whether he does depends on whether I send a follow-up. I paused. "I haven't sent a follow-up. I was hoping you'd make that unnecessary." Harlan Dusk was silent for a long time. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him, and he looked at it and he thought. Then he said, "She's not worth it." I said, "That's your problem, Harlan. You don't know what anything's worth." I stood up. "Stay away from Fetterman. Stay away from Vera Connell. Do that and we're done." I walked out of the Dusty Well into the cold November air and stood in the street for a moment. The sky up above the Mesa country was that deep end-of-day color, somewhere between blue and nothing, and the cold was coming in off the flats with a smell of snow in it. Maybe a day out. Maybe two. I went back to the schoolhouse. She was still there at her desk now, correcting something. The lamp was going on the front wall and the light was the good kind, the even kind that makes a room feel like a room instead of just a building. She looked up when I came in, and this time I let myself notice what her face did. She was relieved. Not just relieved, glad. There's a difference. She said, "Is it done?" I said, "I think so." She said, "You think?" I said, "He's a proud man. Proud men take time to accept what they can't change, but he's a calculating proud man, which means eventually the numbers win." I sat down in one of the children's chairs, which was comically small, and she looked at that and almost smiled. Almost. "He knows now that going after you means I come, and I come ready. Eventually that wears through." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why do you keep doing this?" I said, "It's my job." She said, "It stopped being your job in September when you subpoenaed his ledger on your own time. And it stopped being your job when you rode 2 hours to tell me about Cray in town and when you rode here today." She looked at me steadily. "So why?" I thought about that. The lamp put light across the side of her face, and she sat very still, waiting. And I thought about the 19 years and the quiet house and the last card in the hand, and what Felix Prout had said on the Mesa Road. I said, "Because you're worth it. Whatever he said in there, the man doesn't know what anything's worth, but I do." I looked at the floor of the schoolhouse, then back at her, and I'm not done yet. I've got a few good years left, and I'd like to spend them doing something that matters. You matter. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, I'm not going to pretend that doesn't mean something to me. I said, you don't have to pretend anything. She stood up from her desk and came around it, and she stopped in front of me. I was still in the ridiculous small chair, which meant she was looking slightly down at me, and she reached out and put her hand on my face, her palm against my jaw, and just held it there. Her hand was warm, calloused from work, which I'd expected, but warm. She said, you're the first person in a long time who's treated me like I was worth the trouble. I put my hand over hers, didn't move it, just put my hand there. I said, you are. That was November. The snow came that night, light and early, and by morning Fetterman was white and quiet, and I rode back to Cutter County with the world hushed around me and something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, or not just that. More like the particular weight of knowing that what you did mattered, that you were in the right place doing the right thing for someone who deserved it, that there was a reason to make the coffee in the morning. We wrote through the winter. Her letters were different after November. Not softer exactly, she was never soft but less careful, more of her actual voice in them. She told me things about her Ohio childhood, about the sister she missed, about a student named Cal whose father didn't see the point of education for a girl, and how Vera had gone and spoken to the man personally and changed his mind. I believed she'd changed his mind. I'd seen how she looked at a person when she decided something. In February, she wrote to ask if I'd ever considered retiring. I wrote back to say I'd considered it and never found a reason to. She wrote back to say maybe reasons were available if I looked. I looked. I rode to Fetterman on the first warm Saturday in March, when the snow was going off the flats and the mud was thick, and the sky was the kind of pale winter-ending blue that feels like a promise. I got there in the late morning. Found her at the boarding house, in the garden again, different house than Elsa's, but something the same about her in a garden. Hands in the cold dirt, starting something early. She looked up when she heard the gate. She said, you came. I said, you said to look. She stood up, wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at me for a moment the way she'd looked at me in October, the first time measuring. But the measuring was different now. It wasn't the last card look. It was the look of a woman who's already decided and is just confirming. She said, there's a deputy position open in Palo County, something like an undersheriff. You know the work without having to learn it. I said, I know. She said, I asked after it, for you. I hope that wasn't forward. I said, that's the least forward thing you've done. I had my hat in my hands and I was turning it the way I do when I'm thinking, and she watched my hands and I stopped doing it and looked at her. I'm not good at making things sound the way they should sound. I never have been. She said, then say it plain. I said, I'd like to be where you are, that's all, for however long you'll have me. She looked at me for a long time. The pale sky was going in and out of cloud, the light shifting. Then she stepped forward and she put both her hands flat on my chest, one on each side, and looked up at me the way a person looks at something they've decided is true. She said, I'll have you a good long while, Sheriff. I put my arms around her. She was a solid, real person, not delicate, never delicate, the kind of woman who's been through enough that there's substance to her. She put her forehead against my jaw and I could feel her breathe, even and steady. I said, Crane, nobody calls me Sheriff who's standing this close. She laughed then. I felt it more than heard it. Short and real, not a performance laugh, just the actual thing. I am 61 years old. I tell this to my son-in-law when he asks, because he's younger and thinks that's old, and I say to him, there's something that happens at a certain age when you stop waiting for life to come to you, and you start going after the part that's left. Not desperate, just clear. I knew what I wanted and I knew why I wanted it, and I was done with the quiet house. Vera and I were married in May in the Fetterman church, which was not a big church, but it was clean. 17 schoolchildren attended because she'd told them about it and they'd asked to come, and she said yes. Felix Prout came from Cutter, and Aldous and Garrett Hughes, who cried a little and would be embarrassed about that for years. Elsa Marsh was there. Harlan Dusk never came near her again. I sent that follow-up letter to Santa Fe in April anyway, not as a threat, just because it was right. The undersheriff position in Palo County worked out. The work is the same work it's always been, the kind that matters, the kind that needs doing. I'm slower than I was, but I'm more certain. There's a value to that. A man who's made up his mind completely is harder to move than a faster, younger man who's still working it out. I come home at the end of the day to a lit window. She's usually at the table in the kitchen, either marking student work or reading, and she looks up when I come in, and that's the thing, just that. The looking up. Like I'm a specific expected thing, not just someone coming through the door. Like the room was waiting for me to be in it. I hung my star on the nail by the door one evening last fall, and she was watching, and she said, "Does that feel strange, not wearing it home?" I said, "Not anymore." She said, "Good," and went back to her reading. Outside, the Mesa country was going dark, the way it goes, slow and wide and all at once. The lamp put its light out the window into the yard. The coffee was on. My hat was on the hook. That's it, that's the whole of it. The roan came in without a rider, and there was a woman bound across the saddle, and a note that said she was property. I cut the cowhide off her wrists, and she pressed her hands flat on the rail and breathed. That was the beginning. Everything else was just knowing what a thing was worth.